This is the sermon for the fifth Sunday in Lent. This morning we are reading John's Gospel, the 11th chapter, beginning with the first verse. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you are going back there?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." After he had said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who has come into the world." And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been there, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. There is never a good time to lose someone you love. Whether the person is 9 or 19 or 99, it is almost always too soon. Some years ago, I played Hammond organ with a blues band. We played Chicago-style electric blues, and one of the songs we did was called "Death Don't Have No Mercy." No truer words have been said. Death has a way of sweeping in when we least expect it. And even when death is expected, death is always an interruption. That is the nature of death, an interruption of life. It's fitting that the reading for this last Sunday in Lent bespeaks what might be, up to this point, Jesus' most dramatic miracle. The raising of Lazarus may be described as the pivotal point in Jesus' ministry. It is the place where he undoubtedly seals his fate, as if to suggest that a humanity so entrenched in the mechanics of death cannot possibly tolerate the one who so blithely undoes death. As with so many of the stories about Jesus, this one is what I would call subtly strange. I say subtly because it is so easy in the familiarity of this story for us to miss just how odd, how strange it really is. As we go through the story, I'm going to point out a few of the strangenesses, in the hopes that in honing in on these places, we might gain a few new insights. Now, Jesus hears that Lazarus is ill, the one you love, the messenger says. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are siblings, all living in Bethany, which we are told is a little less than 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. Jesus has a close relationship with them, and they, of all people, seem to be blessed with at least some understanding of who Jesus is. Perhaps that is because he spent time teaching them when he stayed there on his visits to Jerusalem. Perhaps they had a chance even to see him a little more as he really is. So now we hear that Lazarus is ill, and Jesus decides to delay his visit to Bethany. Verse 5 says that Jesus loved these 3 people. Now, if you're reading this text in the NRSV or the NIV translation, you'll see words that are to the effect of, "though he loved them," or "even though," or "yet he stayed 2 more days." But that is a poor translation. If we were to look more deeply into this text, we would discover that a better translation is, "because he loved them, he delayed 2 days." Really? The man is sick unto death, So Jesus delays his visit by 2 days. In retrospect, we can read what he said to his disciples. The illness will not end in death. But his disciples didn't really understand this. And certainly Martha and Mary were not in a position to look into the future. So that's the first really strange thing, and the first point for us. Jesus, it seems, is not interested in superficial comfort. Of course, he could have stopped what he was doing and healed Lazarus. In fact, he might not have had to go there at all. Jesus was known to have accomplished healings at a great distance before. But Jesus is about something else, something far grander than anyone can imagine. Jesus is not about a simple patching up of the effects of the malady. Jesus is about getting at the root cause of the problem. That is true of how Jesus dealt with Lazarus and his sisters, and how he deals with us, and in fact how, as we shall see, he is about to deal with the whole world. So 2 days pass, and now Jesus wants to head to Judea, and his disciples don't want him to go there. In fact, they are not too keen on going there themselves either. They tried to stone you there, and now we're going back? Why exactly? And here we encounter another strangeness. Just as a general point, when you're reading the Gospels and something seems really weird, I believe that's kind of like an exclamation point, something put there to make you stop in your tracks and think. Jesus says, are there not 12 hours in a day, 12 hours of light in which to work? Then the night comes, and no one can work without stumbling. I suppose this piece of strangeness could mean a lot of things, but the next point for us, some things are time sensitive. There are some things that require doing that must be done within the right time frame. If one waits too long, the moment is lost, and the plan will fail, or at least not work very well. We realize now, of course, that the time had come for Jesus to be lifted up. Jesus needed to be about his Father's business. This was the time when the pivotal event of Jesus' crucifixion, the ultimate scapegoating, must take place. The disciples needed to see Jesus' resurrection power, and so did the world. So Thomas says, I imagine reluctantly, if not even sarcastically, let us then go to Jerusalem, so that we may die with him. Now we come to the scene in Bethany, and at first it seems things have gone from bad to worse. Not only is Lazarus dead, but he has been dead for 4 days. We're told that many Jews came to comfort Mary and Martha, so they must have been fairly prominent people. Lazarus' death would have sent ripples through the community, even into the heart of Judea. Now, Martha comes out to meet Jesus, and she tells him, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. I wonder at that saying. Was Martha angry, sarcastic, accusing? When she says, even now I know that God will give you whatever you want, was she sincere? When Jesus asked her if she believed, and she replies with a kind of theological answer, on the last day he will rise, was that a statement of faith or an expression of agony? Yes, yes, I know he will live again then. But he's dead now. And that brings us to the next strange thing. Martha gives all the right answers. Yes, Lord, I believe. But then she goes off immediately to get her sister. "He is calling for you," she says. But in reality, to the best of our knowledge, Jesus had not called for Mary. He didn't say to Martha, "Go get your sister." It seems that Martha does not want to be in this conversation alone. Perhaps Martha is the wise one here and knows that Mary needs to hear what Jesus is saying. Or perhaps what Jesus is saying is just so strange and so infuriating, she wants some backup. Can you believe this man? Indeed, can you believe this man? But at any rate, when Mary hears Jesus' name, she comes running. Now Mary says the same thing Martha did. "If you had only been here sooner." Did she have the same attitude as her sister? "Why didn't you get here on time? Why didn't you fix this?" Of course, we can't know what is in the heart, the mind of these sisters. It very well may be that, like any of us, their thoughts and emotions get jumbled up in times of great stress. The way they think of the situation, what they think of Jesus, of God, is all a confusion. Angry, accusatory, and yet still clinging to him. So Mary is crying, and the Jews all around are crying. And Jesus cries. And that's the next strange thing, the next exclamation point. Why did Jesus cry? I've been asked that before. It seems he knew from the start he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He tells the disciples as much. So why cry? Here are a few possible reasons. Jesus is not a distant idol, unfeeling and unconcerned. Though imbued with all aspects of divinity, if you cut him, he will bleed. I believe the things that make us cry also make God cry. What breaks our hearts also breaks his. Perhaps a part of learning to follow Jesus may be to allow the opposite to happen, to allow what breaks God's heart also to break ours. It is possible that Jesus may not just be weeping over Lazarus. He may be weeping over the whole nature of humanity, so deeply subjugated under the tyranny of death that our whole lives are governed by death. Lazarus and his sisters may be a microcosm of the human condition. Jesus may be crying because death is the enemy. In God's cosmology, death is not simply a part of life to be blithely accepted. It is a most dread enemy. If anyone would rage against the dying of the light, it would be Jesus. Now, the Jews looking on have mixed reactions. Some say, "See how he loved him," and they understand a little bit. For Jesus does love Lazarus and his sisters. What they don't yet realize is that Jesus loves them as well. God will weep on the day they die as well. And God will weep on the day that you die as well. And he will raise them and you to new life. But some of the Jews begin to accuse. He gave sight to a blind man. Couldn't he have helped his friend? God, we want miracles. We want them now, and we want them our way. Jesus is troubled in his spirit. He is moved. He groans. He is angry. And he gives a foreshadowing of what he is really all about by defeating death. And in giving life back to Lazarus, he ensures his own death. For in making a mockery of death, he effectively makes a mockery of the kingdoms of this world that have their foundations on a culture of death. The temporal powers, the religious authorities and hierarchy, all have a stock in death, in the fear of death. And in their hearts, they would not tolerate one who can undo death. Jesus himself must die. Now, Jesus has the stone moved, not before being given some advice by the ever-practical Martha. And Jesus calls Lazarus out. Lazarus, of course, comes forth, all wrapped up in grave clothes. I wonder if this is supposed to be Johannine comic relief after all the tears and accusations. He must have looked pretty funny, waddling out of the grave, hands and feet bound with a cloth over his face. So Jesus tells the people standing there, unbind him. And again, this part is strange. It's our last strangeness and our last point for now. If Jesus could raise Lazarus from the dead, surely he could have moved the stone by himself, and surely he could have just zapped Lazarus' grave wrappings into oblivion. Instead, he gives the bystanders, perhaps even some of the same people who were accusatory, a part in this story of life. I'm going to go out on a bit of an exegetical limb here. Jesus is about life. Jesus may be said to be the anti-death. Jesus means the defeat of death. For Lazarus, and for himself, as we shall see next week, also and especially for you and for me and for the whole world. But he intends for us to have a hand in the story of life. We must roll away the impediments that keep people trapped in the tombs of their ignorance and connectedness to the systems of death. We must unbind those who have heard Jesus call, yet are still bound up in the accoutrements of death. For while Jesus is the bringer of new life, praise be to God, we are a part of the story.